The emergency buzzer tore through the silence at 2:47 a.m. in Melissa Lee's fortified basement clinic. She was sterilizing a set of forceps when her security monitor lit up with a man collapsing against her reinforced door, leaving a dark smear of blood on the steel. Her pulse spiked. Her hand moved instinctively to the taser mounted beneath her workbench. No one came to her door at this hour. Not unless they were dying and couldn't risk a hospital. Not unless they were the kind of people who lived in the margins of legality. 3 years ago, she'd walked away from a residency at Mercy General after watching administrators turn away gunshot victims to avoid police reports. They had given her a choice: follow protocol or leave. She'd chosen to leave, and built this clinic in the industrial district where questions weren't asked and cash was the only insurance accepted. But tonight felt different. Through the grainy feed, she watched him struggle to his feet. Expensive suit now ruined. Dark hair matted with rain and sweat. A face she recognized instantly from the notification that had pinged on her phone 17 minutes ago. Bounty alert, Maxwell Max Perkins, $50 million dead or alive. Melissa's stomach dropped. She knew that face. Everyone in the underworld knew that face. Max Perkins, the youngest mafia boss to ever hold the seat of the old guard. The man whose name could empty a room or fill a graveyard. And he was bleeding out on her doorstep. She reached for the door release, then hesitated. $50 million. That was generational wealth. That was freedom from this concrete box. That was. The buzzer sounded again. Weaker this time. She hit the release. Max stumbled through the threshold and caught himself on the examination table, his gray eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made the sterile air feel electric. Even half dead, he carried himself like a man who'd never learned to ask for anything. Melissa Lee's. His voice was rough, strained with pain, but certain. Not a question. A statement. Underground medic. Former surgical resident. 43 successful extractions in the past 18 months. 0 reports to authorities. She grabbed a stack of gauze and moved toward him with clinical detachment. And you're Max Perkins, which means every assassin in a 100-mile radius is tracking your blood trail to my door right now. Then you'd better work fast. He pulled open his jacket to reveal a gunshot wound in his side, just below the ribs. Professional placement. Meant to bleed him slowly. Because I need you to keep me alive until dawn. 6 hours and 13 minutes. Melissa pressed the gauze hard against the wound, ignoring his sharp intake of breath. Why dawn? Because that's when the Mafia Council convenes for the emergency session. And if I'm not there, alive and married, Silas Vane takes everything. She froze. Her eyes snapped up to his face. What did you just say? Max reached into his inner pocket with his free hand and pulled out a legal document, sealed with the old guard's emblem, a black serpent coiled around a dagger. Blood smeared across the paper as he held it up. The old guard has one law written by my grandfather. No unmarried man can hold the seat. It's an outdated tradition meant to ensure succession. I've ignored it for 3 years. He paused, his jaw tightening. Silas made sure I couldn't ignore it anymore. He killed the woman I was supposed to marry next month. Then he put a $50 million bounty on my head to make sure I wouldn't live long enough to find a replacement. And what does that have to do with me? Max's eyes didn't waver. They were the gray of storm clouds before lightning strikes. You're the only person in this city skilled enough to keep me breathing until dawn and invisible enough to keep me off Silas's radar. He's locked down every high-end district with facial recognition scanners. Every church, every courthouse, every place someone like me would go to get married. But down here, he glanced around the cramped clinic with its flickering fluorescent lights and reinforced walls. This is the one place he'd never look. Melissa's mind raced. She pressed harder on the wound, feeling warm blood seep between her fingers. You're insane. You want me to patch you up and marry you? In 6 hours. 5 hours and 58 minutes now. Max's hand shot out and caught her wrist, not aggressive but desperate. Steady despite the blood loss. I'll pay you $10 million. Cash. Untraceable. Enough to expand this clinic. Enough to never have to choose between saving a life and protecting yourself again. $10 million. The number hung in the air like a detonation. But Melissa had learned long ago that money from men like Max Perkins came with a price written in blood. She pulled her wrist free and grabbed a scalpel from her tray, holding it steady at the hollow of his throat. There's a bounty on your head, max 50 million reasons for me to let you bleed out and make a phone call. You're not buying a wife. She let the blade rest against his skin, just enough pressure to make her point. You're buying a graveyard plot. Max didn't flinch, didn't even blink. Instead, something like respect flickered across his face. You're right, he said quietly. I am. But here's the difference. He leaned forward slightly, the scalpel pressing deeper, a thin line of red appearing on his neck. If you turn me in, Silas wins. And the first thing he'll do as the new boss is clean house. That means every person who ever patched up one of my people, every doctor who looked away, every medic who kept their mouth shut. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. He'll burn this clinic to the ground with you inside it. Because dead witnesses can't testify. Melissa's hand trembled. Not from fear. From rage. Because she knew he was right. And if I say yes? If I do this insane thing and marry you? Max's expression shifted. The desperation was still there, but beneath it was something else. Something that looked almost like vulnerability. Then I erase your name from every list. I put you under the old guard's protection. And when this is over, when I take my seat and Silas is dealt with, you walk away clean. No strings. No debts. He paused. You'll have the money and the freedom to save lives without looking over your shoulder every night. Melissa stared at him. A powerful mafia boss, bleeding on her examination table at 3 a.m, offering her a deal that was either salvation or suicide. Part of her wanted to call his bluff. I wanted to press that scalpel deeper and watch $50 million worth of problems solve themselves. But there was something in the way he looked at her. Like she wasn't just a convenience or a means to an end. Like she was the only person in the world who could save him. Not from the bullet wound. From everything that came after. Fine, she said, lowering the scalpel. But we do this my way. You stay in my apartment. You follow my rules. And if you bring Silas's people to my door, I won't. If you do, she continued, her voice ice cold, I'll finish what that bullet started. Max Perkins smiled for the first time since collapsing into her clinic. It was a sharp, dangerous smile that belonged to a man who'd built an empire on calculated risks. Deal, he said. And Melissa realized, as she began cutting away his blood-soaked suit to access the wound, that she'd just agreed to marry the most wanted man in the city. The clock on the wall read 2:53 a.m. 5 hours and 7 minutes until dawn. 5 hours and 7 minutes until she became Mrs. Maxwell Perkins. Or a widow. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 2,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Melissa worked in silence, her hands moving with the mechanical precision of someone who'd stopped feeling squeamish about blood years ago. The bullet had missed the kidney by 2 centimeters. Professional work meant to incapacitate, not kill immediately. She irrigated the wound, sutured the damaged tissue, and wrapped his torso tight enough to restrict movement, but not breathing. Max watched her the entire time, his gray eyes tracking every motion of her hands. He didn't flinch when she jabbed the local anesthetic in. Didn't make a sound when she extracted a fragment of his rib that had splintered from the impact. You're good at this, he said finally. I'm good at keeping people alive long enough to make bad decisions. She tied off the final suture and stepped back, stripping off her bloodied gloves. Speaking of which, you're not going anywhere near your penthouse, your office, or whatever five-star hotel you usually bleed in. Max raised an eyebrow. I wasn't planning to. Good. Because Silas isn't an idiot. Melissa moved to her computer and pulled up a map of the city, overlaid with pulsing red zones. See these? Facial recognition grids. Every district north of Industrial Avenue is wired with them. Banks, government buildings, high-end retail, all feeding into a central database. You show your face in any of those areas, and Silas will have a kill team on you in under 4 minutes. She zoomed in on the southern industrial corridor, a cluster of gray blocks marked with minimal surveillance coverage. This is the Flats. Low-income housing, factories, cash-only businesses. No facial recognition because the city doesn't care enough to install it. It's also where my apartment is. Max leaned forward, studying the screen. You want me to hide in the slums. I want you to hide in the one place where a man in a blood-soaked Armani suit won't last 5 minutes without me. She turned to face him, crossing her arms. Here's how this works. You stay in my apartment. You don't leave. You don't make calls on any device that can be traced. You don't contact your people until absolutely necessary. And most importantly, she stepped closer, her voice dropping to a deadly calm. You follow my rules. This is my world, Max down here. Your name means nothing. Your money means nothing. The only thing keeping you alive is me. Max's expression shifted. The arrogance bled away, replaced by something she hadn't expected, calculation. He was reassessing her. Not as a tool, but as an equal. What are your terms? You don't touch anything without asking. You eat what I cook. You sleep on the couch. And if anyone knocks on that door, you become invisible. She paused. One more thing. The wedding happens in the Flats. There's a priest who runs a community center 3 blocks from my building. He doesn't ask questions, and he doesn't keep records. Father Dominic, Max said quietly. I know him. Melissa blinked. How do you? I funded the renovation of his community center 2 years ago. Anonymous donation. Max's smile was bitter. Even men like me need to buy forgiveness sometimes. The admission hung between them, unexpected and strangely human. Then you know he can be trusted, Melissa said finally. We go at first light. 5 a.m. Before the streets wake up. Max nodded slowly, then extended his hand. Deal. Melissa looked at his outstretched palm, still stained with his own blood, and shook it. She'd just agreed to hide a $50 million target in her 400-square-foot apartment. The clock read 3:17 a.m. 4 hours and 43 minutes until she married a man whose enemies would burn the world to kill him. 4 hours and 43 minutes until her invisible life became the most dangerous gamble she'd ever taken. Welcome to the rat hole, she said. Max actually laughed, a low, dark sound that echoed in the sterile clinic like thunder before a storm. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Flats, the kind of morning where the city looked like it was holding its breath. Melissa led Max through a maze of back alleys, keeping to the shadows beneath fire escapes and defunct security cameras. He moved slower than she'd like, one hand pressed to his bandaged side, but he kept pace without complaint. Father Dominic's community center sat wedged between a shuttered pawn shop and a laundromat that never closed. The priest was waiting at the side entrance, his weathered face unreadable as he ushered them into a cramped office that smelled of old coffee and incense. Miss Lees, he said quietly, his eyes shifting to Max, I wasn't expecting you to bring company. Emergency wedding, Melissa said. Can you do it? Now. The priest studied them both for a long moment. He had the kind of eyes that had seen too much suffering to be shocked by anything, but there was a flicker of concern when his gaze landed on the blood seeping through Max's shirt. Are you in danger, child? We both are, Max said before Melissa could answer. which is why we need this done quickly. Father Dominic nodded slowly and retrieved a worn Bible from his desk. Then let's not waste time. They stood facing each other in the cramped office. No flowers, no music, no witnesses except a priest who'd learned long ago that God's work often happened in the margins. Melissa's phone sat on the desk behind her, split screen showing 4 different security feeds from cameras she'd positioned around the block. Father Dominic began the abbreviated ceremony, his voice steady and practiced. "Dearly beloved," Melissa's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. 2 black sedans had just turned onto their street. "Keep going," she murmured. Max's eyes flicked to the phone, then back to her face. His jaw tightened, but he didn't move. "Do you, Maxwell Perkins, take this woman?" Another buzz. 3 men in tactical gear exiting the vehicles, earpieces visible, hands inside their jackets. Professional. Methodical. They were sweeping the block, checking doorways. "I do," Max said, his voice sharp and clear. Melissa's heart hammered against her ribs. The men were 2 buildings away. One of them was scanning with a handheld device. Thermal imaging, probably searching for body heat signatures through walls. "Do you, Melissa Lees, take this man?" She watched the feed. The men were conferring now, one of them pointing toward the community center. 40 seconds, maybe less. "I do." Father Dominic's hands trembled slightly as he made the sign of the cross. "Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. May God have mercy on your souls." No sooner had the words left his mouth than Melissa grabbed Max's arm and pulled him toward the back exit. "Go. Now." Father Dominic moved to block the office door as footsteps echoed in the front hallway. "I'll buy you time," he said quietly. They burst into the alley behind the center just as voices erupted inside, sharp, demanding, asking about strangers. Melissa dragged Max through a gap in a chain-link fence into the industrial yard beyond, her medical bag bouncing against her hip. Behind them, she heard Father Dominic's calm voice. "I've been preparing for morning mass. I haven't seen anyone." They didn't stop running until they reached her apartment building 3 blocks away. Melissa keyed in the security code with shaking fingers and shoved Max through the door, slamming it shut behind them. The apartment was exactly what she'd promised, a rat hole. 400 square feet of exposed brick, a kitchenette with a hot plate, 1 window covered with blackout curtains, and a couch that had seen better decades. Max leaned against the wall, breathing hard, his shirt dark with fresh blood where the sutures had torn. But when he looked at her, there was something almost like awe in his eyes. "Congratulations, Mrs. Perkins," he said. Melissa pulled out her phone and checked the feeds. The hitmen were leaving, climbing back into their vehicles, disappearing into the gray morning. "Congratulations, husband," she replied, her voice hollow. "You just made me the most dangerous woman in the city." Outside, sirens wailed in the distance. Inside, the clock on her wall ticked towards 6:47 a.m. They were married, and the real nightmare was just beginning. Max spent the first hour pacing the apartment like a caged animal, despite Melissa's warnings that he was going to tear his stitches. He made 3 attempts to use his phone before she physically confiscated it, explaining for the 3rd time that Silas's people could triangulate his location from a single cellular ping. "I need to contact my security team," he said, his voice carrying that familiar edge of command. "They need to know I'm alive. They'll know when you show up at the council meeting." Melissa was at the kitchenette, heating canned soup on the hot plate. "Until then, you're a ghost." Max stopped pacing and turned to face her, his posture straightening despite the obvious pain it caused. "I don't take orders well." "Then learn." She didn't even look up from the pot. "Because in this apartment, I'm not your employee. I'm not one of your soldiers. I'm the person keeping you breathing, which means what I say goes." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Melissa could feel him trying to reassert control, trying to find the angle that would shift the power dynamic back in his favor. It was fascinating, really, watching a man who'd built an empire on dominance struggle with the reality that down here, his name meant nothing. "I'm not used to being powerless," he said finally. "Good. Maybe it'll teach you something." She ladled soup into two mismatched bowls and set them on the small table that served as both dining area and workspace. "Eat. You need to keep your strength up." Max sat, eyeing the soup with barely concealed skepticism. "What is this?" "Chicken noodle. From a can. Welcome to how the other 99% live." She took a spoonful, meeting his gaze with deliberate calm. "If you're waiting for a personal chef, you're going to starve." He ate in silence, and she watched him process each new indignity. The chipped bowl, the dented spoon, the soup that tasted like salt and preservation. When they finished, Max stood and moved toward the couch. "Leave the dishes," Melissa said. He paused. "What?" "The dishes. You use them, you wash them." She gestured to the tiny sink. "House rules." Max stared at her like she'd just asked him to disarm a bomb. "I don't do dishes." "You do now." Melissa settled into the worn armchair across from the couch, pulling out her tablet to check the security feeds. "You want to survive the next 18 hours? You contribute. This isn't a hotel, Max. You don't get to act like a king in a kingdom that doesn't exist anymore." The muscle in his jaw twitched. For a moment, she thought he might refuse, might try to pull rank or offer her money to do it herself. But then something shifted in his expression, a flicker of realization, maybe, or resignation. He walked to the sink. Melissa tried not to smile as she watched Maxwell Perkins, head of the Old Guard, a man who commanded armies and controlled half the city's underground economy, figure out how to work a dish soap bottle. He scrubbed the bowls with far more aggression than necessary, water splashing onto his expensive shirt. "You're using too much soap," she said without looking up. "I know what I'm doing. Clearly." She glanced at the mountain of suds threatening to overflow the sink. "There's a learning curve." When he finished, both bowls cleaned, though not particularly well, he dried his hands on the threadbare towel and turned to face her. His shirt was soaked. His hair was disheveled. The bandage around his torso showed a small bloom of fresh blood. He looked more human than she'd ever seen him. "Satisfied?" he asked. Melissa set down her tablet and met his eyes. "It's a start." Max moved to the couch and lowered himself carefully onto the cushions. The exhaustion was finally catching up to him, the adrenaline of the past hours giving way to the reality of his wounds. "You enjoy this," he said quietly. "Humbling me." "I enjoy keeping you alive," Melissa corrected. "The humbling is just a bonus." Outside, the city continued its relentless rhythm. Inside, the most powerful man in the underworld fell asleep on a couch that smelled faintly of mildew, in an apartment barely bigger than his closet. And Melissa realized, watching him breathe steadily in the dim light, that she'd just taught Maxwell Perkins his first lesson in survival. Power wasn't about control. It was about knowing when to let go. The knock came at 9:47 p.m., 3 sharp raps that made Melissa's blood run cold. She was checking Max's sutures when the sound echoed through the apartment. Max's hand moved instinctively toward his empty hip. No gun, she'd made him leave it in the clinic, and his eyes snapped to hers. She held up one finger. "Wait." Through the peephole, she saw Marcus Chun, her neighbor from 4B. Mid-30s, perpetually unemployed, the kind of man who spent too much time watching other people's business. He was sweating despite the cool evening air, his phone clutched tight in his hand. Melissa opened the door just wide enough to block his view inside. "Marcus. It's late." "Yeah, I know, He craned his neck, trying to see past her. "I thought I heard voices." "You got company. My boyfriend's visiting." The lie came smoothly. "Why?" Marcus's eyes gleamed with something predatory. "Funny thing. There's a bounty going around on the dark web. 50 million for some mafia guy." He held up his phone, showing Max's face on the screen. Real specific description. Tall, dark hair, gray eyes, scar on his neck. And I could have sworn I saw someone matching that description going into your place this morning. Melissa's heart slammed against her ribs, but her face remained perfectly neutral. You're seeing things, Marcus. I told you, it's just my boyfriend. Right. Your boyfriend. He leaned closer, his voice dropping. How about you let me see him? Just to be sure. Because if it is this Perkins guy, and I make that call. He whistled low. 50 million splits real nice. Behind her, Melissa heard the soft creak of floorboards. Max was moving into position. Marcus, she said carefully, you really don't want to do this. I think I do. His hand moved toward his phone. Unless you want to make it worth my while to forget what I saw. Melissa stepped back, letting the door swing wider. Come in. Marcus's smile was triumphant as he crossed the threshold. He made it 3 steps before Max's arm locked around his throat from behind, cutting off his air supply with surgical precision. The phone clattered to the floor. Don't kill him, Melissa hissed, slamming the door shut. I'm not. Max's voice was cold, clinical. But he needs to understand the situation. Melissa picked up Marcus's phone and checked the screen. No call made yet. No message sent. They still had time. She crouched in front of Marcus, whose face was turning purple, and spoke with the same calm she used in the clinic. Here's what's going to happen. My husband is going to let you breathe. You're going to sit down. And we're going to have a conversation about why making that call would be the last mistake you ever make. Max released the pressure slightly. Marcus gasped, dragging in air. Sit, Melissa commanded, pointing to the chair. Marcus stumbled into the seat, clutching his throat. Max positioned himself behind the chair, one hand resting on Marcus's shoulder, a casual gesture that promised violence. Melissa pulled up her own tablet and navigated to a series of files she'd kept as insurance over the years. Marcus Chin. 3 outstanding warrants for credit card fraud in Nevada. A sealed juvenile record I can unseal with one phone call. And, she paused, watching his face drain of color, the fact that you've been stealing medication from my clinic to sell on the street. You can't prove that. I have a video. She turned the tablet around, showing him clear footage of him picking the lock on her clinic door 6 weeks ago. So here's the deal. You delete every trace of that bounty from your phone. You forget you ever saw anyone come into this building. And you never, ever speak about this night again. And if I don't, Max's grip tightened on his shoulder. Then I stopped being merciful. The weight of those words settled over the room like a shroud. Marcus looked between them, the medic who knew all his secrets and the mafia boss who could make him disappear, and made the only choice he could. His shaking fingers opened the phone and started deleting. Melissa watched every keystroke, verifying each deletion, checking his browser history, his messages, his cloud backups. When she was satisfied, she took the phone and removed the SIM card, crushing it beneath her boot. You can get a new one tomorrow, she said. Now get out. Marcus fled without another word, the door slamming behind him. Max sank onto the couch, his hand pressed against his side where the wound had reopened during the struggle. Melissa was already moving, grabbing fresh gauze. First team effort, she said, kneeling beside him to inspect the damage. Not bad. Max looked down at her, something unreadable in his gray eyes. You had leverage on him the whole time. Always have insurance. She began rebandaging the wound. Down here, information is the only currency that matters. You'd fit right in with the old guard. No thanks. She tied off the bandage. I prefer my threats to be non-lethal. Max caught her wrist gently as she started to pull away. Thank you for not letting me kill him. Melissa met his gaze and saw something she hadn't expected, genuine gratitude. We're a team now, she said quietly. For better or worse. Outside, Marcus's footsteps faded down the hallway. Inside, the silence felt different. Less like a standoff. More like an alliance. The power grid failed at 11:43 p.m., plunging the entire industrial district into darkness. Melissa's emergency radio crackled to life with the official explanation. Transformer malfunction. Crews were working on it. Estimated restoration time unknown. But she knew better. Silas had contacts everywhere, including the city's infrastructure department. "It's not a coincidence," Max said from the window, peering through a gap in the blackout curtains. "He's forcing us to move." Melissa was already packing. Medical supplies, cash, the forged documents she'd prepared for emergencies. "The council meeting is in 9 hours. If we stay here without power, we're sitting targets. If we move now, we use the blackout as cover. Where do we go?" "There's a safe house in the warehouse district. Old textile factory, abandoned for years. I've used it before." She tossed him a dark jacket. "We move fast and quietly. No streetlights means no cameras, but it also means we're blind." They left the apartment at midnight, navigating the pitch-black hallway by feel. The emergency stairwell was a void of concrete and echoing footsteps. Melissa led with a penlight, keeping the beam low, while Max followed close enough that she could hear his breathing. The street outside was chaotic. Car alarms wailed. Voices shouted in the distance. The blackout had turned the flats into a lawless zone, and they had 6 blocks to cover. They made it 3 blocks before headlights swept around the corner. Melissa grabbed Max's arm and pulled him into the service entrance of a derelict building. The freight elevator stood open, its metal cage door hanging crooked. "Inside," she whispered. They squeezed into the elevator just as footsteps pounded past on the street. Melissa pressed herself against the back wall, Max inches from her in the cramped space. The cage rattled with every breath. Through the gaps in the metal, they watched flashlight beams sweep the entrance. "Check the buildings," a voice ordered. Professional. Military cadence. Melissa's hand found the elevator controls in the dark. She pulled the cage door shut as quietly as possible, wincing at every scrape of metal on metal. Max's hand covered hers on the control lever, steadying it. "Wait," he breathed against her ear. The footsteps were inside now, boots on concrete, getting closer. In the absolute darkness of the elevator, Melissa could feel everything: Max's chest against her back, his breath on her neck, the tension coiled in his body ready to strike if they were discovered. The beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness, sweeping across the elevator shaft. Melissa held her breath. Max's arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her tighter into the shadows. The light moved on. Voices faded. The footsteps receded. Neither of them moved. Max's hand was still on her waist, his thumb pressed against her ribs where her heartbeat hammered. Melissa's fingers were locked on the control lever, her knuckles white. "They're gone," she whispered. "I know." But he didn't let go. In the darkness, she felt him shift slightly, his forehead coming to rest against the back of her head. "You're shaking. Adrenaline." "Liar." His voice was low, almost gentle. "You're terrified." Melissa closed her eyes. "I'm keeping us alive. Terror is part of the job description. You've saved my life 3 times in the past 24 hours. His hand moved from her waist to her shoulder, turning her carefully to face him. In the faint glow from distant emergency lights filtering through the shaft, she could just make out the sharp angles of his face. "Why?" "Because you're my husband," she said, the words feeling strange and true at once. "And because I don't let people die on my watch." "Is that the only reason?" The question hung between them in the small space, charged with something neither of them had acknowledged. Melissa could feel the heat of him, could smell the copper of blood and the expensive cologne that clung to his ruined shirt. Could see the way his gray eyes had softened, looking at her like she was something precious instead of useful. "We should move," she said, but she didn't step back. Max's hand came up to her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. "In a minute." The moment stretched, suspended in darkness and danger, and the electric pull of two people who'd been fighting to survive and suddenly realized they were fighting for each other. Then Melissa did step back, breaking the spell. The warehouse. We need to go. Max nodded slowly. Lead the way, Mrs. Perkins. They slipped out of the elevator and into the night, moving like shadows through the blackout city. But something had shifted between them in that cramped metal cage. Something that made the darkness feel less empty. Something that felt dangerously close to trust. And maybe something more. They made it to the warehouse just as the power grid flickered back to life. Melissa was securing the reinforced door when Max's confiscated phone, the one she'd kept powered off in her bag, began vibrating with incoming messages. Dozens of them. All at once. Her stomach dropped. Max saw her face. What is it? She pulled out the phone and her own device, comparing screens. Every dark web forum, every criminal network, every burner app was lighting up with the same message. A video. Posted 3 minutes ago. Silas Vane's face filled the screen, his smile sharp as a blade. Good morning, hunters. By now, Maxwell Perkins is somewhere in the industrial district, hiding like the coward he is. I'm updating the bounty. $75 million to whoever brings me proof of death before 8 a.m. He paused, his eyes glittering with malice. And to make things interesting, I'm releasing his last known coordinates. The screen shifted to a map. A red pin dropped on the textile warehouse. Their warehouse. He triangulated the phone, Melissa breathed. Even powered off, he tracked the SIM card's last location before we disabled it. Max was already moving toward the window. How many exits? 3. But they'll cover them all. She pulled up her security feeds on the tablet. The streets around the warehouse were already filled with vehicles. Cars, motorcycles, vans, a small army converging on their position. We have maybe 5 minutes before they breach. The council meets at the Sanctuary Cathedral, Max said, his voice shifting into tactical mode. That's 12 blocks north. We'll never make it on foot. Melissa's mind raced through scenarios, calculating odds, mapping routes. Then her eyes landed on the loading dock. The freight tunnels. They run under the city, connecting to the old subway system. We can move underground. Those tunnels haven't been used in 20 years. Which is exactly why Silas won't expect it. She grabbed her medical bag and started toward the maintenance access on the floor. The cathedral has a basement entrance from the old transit days. If we move fast, the first window shattered. A canister rolled across the floor, spewing thick smoke. Go! Max shoved her toward the hatch as gunfire erupted, bullets punching through the corrugated walls. They dropped into the tunnel system, landing hard on decades of accumulated grime and debris. Melissa's penlight cut through absolute darkness, revealing a maze of concrete passages. Behind them, boots hit the warehouse floor. They ran. The tunnels were a nightmare of collapsed sections and flooded chambers. Melissa navigated by memory and instinct, pulling Max through gaps barely wide enough for their bodies. His breathing was labored, each step reopening his wounds, but he kept pace. Left here, she gasped, splashing through ankle-deep water. Voices echoed behind them. Flashlight beams danced on the walls. The hunters had found the tunnel entrance. They emerged into a wider passage, part of the defunct subway system. Rusted tracks disappeared into darkness in both directions. Melissa checked her compass app. North. The cathedral is. A figure stepped from the shadows ahead. Then another. 3 men, all armed, blocking their path. End of the line, Perkins, one said, raising his weapon. Max stepped in front of Melissa, weaponless but defiant. You really want to do this? 75 million say yes. The man's finger moved toward the trigger. Melissa's hand dove into her medical bag, fingers closing around a syringe of sedative. She threw it like a dart. It buried itself in the man's neck. He dropped before he could fire. The other two turned toward her. Max moved like lightning, driving his elbow into the nearest man's throat, using the momentum to grab his gun and pistol-whip the third. Silence. 3 bodies on the ground. Max looked at Melissa, chest heaving. What was in that syringe? Enough ketamine to drop a horse. She retrieved her medical bag. We need to move. There'll be more. They ran through the tunnels, pursued by voices and gunfire that echoed like thunder. Every intersection brought new threats: hired killers, opportunistic thugs, desperate men chasing generational wealth. Melissa lost count of how many they evaded, how many Max fought off with stolen weapons and brutal efficiency. When they finally reached the cathedral's basement entrance, the sun was rising. Max's shirt was soaked with blood. Melissa's hands were shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion. 7:43, Max said, checking the time. 17 minutes. Melissa looked at him, battered, bleeding, but still standing. Still fighting. Then let's finish this. They climbed the stone stairs together, leaving the darkness behind. Above them, the Mafia Council was waiting. And Silas Vane had no idea they were already inside. They made it to the cathedral's antechamber before Max collapsed. One moment he was walking, the next his knees buckled, and he went down hard against the marble floor. Blood pooled beneath him, dark and spreading fast. Max! Melissa dropped beside him, her hands already assessing the damage. The bandages around his torso were completely saturated. She tore open his shirt and her breath caught. The sutures had torn completely, and worse, she could see fresh trauma. A bullet grazed across his ribs from the tunnel fight, still bleeding. The council, Max gasped, his face gray. I have to. You have to stay conscious. Melissa pulled out her medical bag with shaking hands. Through the antechamber door, she could hear voices in the council chamber. Deep, authoritative, beginning the session. How long until they call you? Minutes. Maybe less. His eyes were unfocused. Silas will demand I forfeit. If I don't appear, you'll appear. She was already threading a needle, hands moving on autopilot. But first I'm closing this wound or you'll bleed out on the council floor. The antechamber door burst open. 2 of Silas's men, guns drawn. They must have been stationed inside, waiting. Well, well, one said, advancing. The rat and his medic. Silas said you might try something desperate. Melissa positioned herself over Max, shielding him with her body. Touch him and I'll make sure you die slower than he will. The man laughed. Move aside, sweetheart. This doesn't concern you. Like hell it doesn't. She didn't move, didn't even flinch when he raised his weapon. I'm his wife. His what? We were married this morning, which means by old guard law, I have the right to speak at council. And if you kill me, you're killing a council member's legal spouse. She met his eyes with absolute steel. That's an executable offense. Even Silas can't protect you from that. The men hesitated. That hesitation was all Max needed. His hand shot out, grabbing the first man's ankle and yanking hard. The gun fired wild as he fell. Melissa lunged for it, her fingers closing around the grip. She'd never fired a gun before. But desperation made her aim true. The shot echoed through the stone chamber. The second man dropped, clutching his leg. Go, Melissa shouted. Lock the door. Max crawled to the entrance and threw the heavy bolt. Fists immediately began pounding from the other side. They had minutes, maybe seconds. Melissa's hands were already back on Max's wound, threading the needle through torn flesh. This is going to hurt. Everything hurts. But his eyes were clear, watching her work. Why are you doing this? Doing what? Saving me. You could walk away right now. Take the 10 million and disappear. Let me bleed out and tell the council Silas's men killed me. His hand found hers, blood slick and trembling. Why? Melissa's needle paused mid-stitch. The pounding on the door was getting louder. Any moment now, they'd break through or find another way in. But in this instant, There was only Max's gray eyes searching hers for truth. "Because it was never about the money," she said quietly. "I realized that in the elevator. Maybe before." She resumed stitching, each movement precise despite her shaking hands. "You asked me why I became a medic. It's because I can't stand watching people die when I have the power to save them. Doesn't matter if they're saints or sinners. I'm definitely a sinner. So am I." She tied off the final suture and applied fresh bandages with brutal efficiency. "Which is why we deserve each other." Max pulled himself upright, using the wall for support. His color was returning, his breathing steadier. "The council can wait 30 more seconds." Melissa grabbed his face in both hands, forcing him to look at her. "You walk in there with your head high. You show them you're not broken. And you make Silas regret every second he thought he could destroy you." Something fierce and bright blazed in Max's eyes. "Come with me." "What?" "To the council. As my wife." He extended his hand. "Let's show them exactly what power looks like." The door was splintering. They were out of time. Melissa took his hand. Together, they walked toward the council chamber, leaving a trail of blood and defiance behind them. And when the doors opened, revealing the assembled old guard and Silas Vane's shocked face, Maxwell Perkins stood tall with his wife beside him. Alive, married, and ready to reclaim his throne. The council chamber fell silent as Max and Melissa entered. 12 men sat around an ancient oak table, the old guard, patriarchs who'd built empires on blood and loyalty. At the far end, Silas Vane stood frozen, his hands still raised mid-gesture, his face contorting from triumph to disbelief in real time. "Impossible," Silas breathed. "You should be dead." And yet, Max walked to his seat at the head of the table, each step deliberate despite the pain. Melissa remained standing beside him, her hand resting on the back of his chair. "I'm very much alive, and very much on time." The eldest council member, Victor Marchetti, leaned forward. His weathered face was unreadable, but his eyes held sharp intelligence. "Maxwell Perkins, you've missed 3 scheduled sessions. Your seat was declared forfeit pending this final meeting. Silas Vane has petitioned for succession, claiming you failed to meet the marriage requirement set forth in your grandfather's will." "I'm aware of the requirement." Max gestured to Melissa. "Which is why I'd like to introduce my wife, Melissa Perkins. We were married this morning by Father Dominic at St. Catherine's Community Center." Silas slammed his hand on the table. "This is a farce. She's nobody, a back-alley medic he probably paid to play the part." "Careful, Silas." Max's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "You're insulting my wife." "Where's the marriage certificate?" Another council member demanded. "We require proof." Melissa reached into her bag and produced the document, still bearing Father Dominic's signature and seal. She placed it on the table, letting it speak for itself. Victor examined it closely, then nodded. "This appears legitimate. The marriage requirement has been satisfied." "No." Silas's face flushed red. "This whole situation reeks of desperation. He married her to save his position, nothing more. The old guard doesn't recognize marriages of convenience." "You're right," Melissa said, her voice cutting through the room like steel. Every head turned toward her. It was convenient. Convenient for Max to have someone who could keep him alive through the $75 million bounty you placed on his head. Convenient for me to have protection from the kill teams you sent to my clinic. Convenient that I could patch his bullet wounds, the ones from the ambush you orchestrated. Silas went very still. "You have no proof of that." "Don't I?" Melissa pulled out her tablet and connected it to the council's projection screen. "This is footage from my security cameras. Timestamp 2:47 a.m. yesterday morning." The video showed Max collapsing at her door, bleeding from a professional hit. Notice the bullet placement. Just below the ribs, designed for slow bleed out. The same technique your personal enforcer, Viktor Kozlov is known for. She advanced to the next slide. This is the dark web bounty posting. Note the specificity of the location data, the real-time tracking updates. Only someone with access to cellular triangulation technology could provide that level of detail. She looked directly at Silas. Technology that requires law enforcement or government connections. The kind of connections you've been building to overthrow Max. The council members exchanged glances. Victor's expression had hardened. Melissa continued, her voice steady despite the room full of dangerous men watching her every move. But here's what matters most. Silas claimed this marriage was about convenience and money. He's partially right. Max offered me $10 million to marry him. She paused, letting that sink in. I turned him down. Silas's eyes narrowed. Then why? Because somewhere between stitching his wounds and running through tunnels while your hired killers hunted us, I realized something. Melissa's hand found Max's shoulder. A marriage based on survival becomes something real when both people choose to stay alive for each other, not just themselves. You can't buy that, Silas. You can't fake it, and you sure as hell can't destroy it. She turned to address the entire council. I'm not an old guard. I'm not from your world. But I know what loyalty looks like, and I know what treachery looks like. Max Perkins earned his seat. You, she pointed at Silas. You tried to steal it through murder and manipulation. The silence that followed was absolute. Victor Marchetti stood slowly. The council will vote. All in favor of recognizing Maxwell Perkins's marriage and reinstating his full authority, raise your hand. 11 hands rose. Only Silas remained down. The vote is decided. Victor's gaze fixed on Silas like a blade. Maxwell Perkins retains his seat. And you, Silas Vane, will answer for your actions. Max stood, pulling Melissa close to his side. Take him into custody. We'll deal with him according to old guard law. As guards moved to restrain Silas, his eyes locked on Melissa with pure hatred. You have no idea what you've done, little medic. I saved my husband's life, Melissa replied calmly, and ended yours. The doors closed on Silas's screaming protests. The council was Max's again, and Melissa Perkins had just proven herself a queen who couldn't be bought, broken, or intimidated. Not bad for a woman from the flats. The bounty came down within the hour. One message from Max to every dark web forum, every criminal network, every hired killer who'd been hunting him. Maxwell Perkins was off limits. The hunt was over. Anyone who violated that order would answer to the full force of the old guard. By noon, the city had returned to its usual rhythm, as if the past 48 hours had been nothing more than a fever dream. Max stood in the penthouse he hadn't seen in days, staring out at a skyline he'd almost lost the right to claim. The doctor had just left after declaring his wounds stable, but requiring weeks of rest. Behind him, Melissa sat on the edge of an imported leather sofa that probably cost more than her entire apartment building. This is your world, she said quietly, taking in the floor-to-ceiling windows, the art that belonged in museums, the silence that money bought. It suits you. Max turned to face her. It's empty. It's safe. So is a tomb. He crossed the room and knelt in front of her, his hands finding hers. Melissa, the council voted to give you a seat if you want it. Full authority. Resources. Protection. You'd never have to hide in the flats again. Never have to patch up criminals in a basement. Never have to choose between saving a life and protecting yourself. Melissa looked at their joined hands, his scarred and powerful, hers stained with old blood and antiseptic. And what would I do with all that power? Anything you want. Build a real hospital. Train other medics. Change the entire underground medical system. His gray eyes were intense, hopeful. You could save hundreds of lives instead of dozens. From a penthouse tower, she pulled one hand free and gestured at the pristine space around them. making decisions at boardroom tables, sending other people to do the work while I count money and attend council meetings. Yes. Melissa stood, walking to the window. Below, the city sprawled in every direction, the gleaming high-rises of the rich districts in one direction, the gritty sprawl of the flats in another. Two worlds. She'd just been offered citizenship in the one she'd spent her life avoiding. I appreciate what you're offering, she said. I really do. But that's not who I am, Max. I'm not a politician or a power broker. I'm a medic. I save lives with my hands, not with money or influence. She turned to face him. My clinic is where I belong. In the shadows. In the margins. With the people who have nowhere else to go. Max's expression shifted through disappointment, understanding, and then something that looked like resignation. I thought you might say that. I'm sorry. Don't be. He stood and walked to his desk, retrieving an envelope. I had my lawyers draw these up this morning. Annulment papers. You fulfilled your end of the bargain. The marriage can be dissolved quietly. You'll still get the 10 million. I told you I don't want your money. Then what do you want? Melissa met his eyes across the expensive space that separated them. I want to know what you want. You have your seat back. Silas is finished. The old guard is yours. You could have anyone. So why are you offering me an annulment instead of just signing it yourself? Max was quiet for a long moment. Then he set down the papers and crossed to her, closing the distance until they were inches apart. Because somewhere between you holding a scalpel to my throat and stitching me back together in a cathedral antechamber, I stopped seeing you as a convenient solution. His hand came up to her face, gentle despite the calluses. I started seeing you as the only person who's ever looked at me and seen something worth saving beyond my name and my power. Max, come back to the flats with me, he said. Not to hide, not to run, but because that's where we both belong. I'll fund your clinic, expand it, give you the resources to do real good. But I won't force you into my world if it's not where you want to be. Melissa stared at him. You'd leave all this? Your penthouse, your empire, your comfort. I'd leave anything. His voice was raw, honest. Because I learned something in your 400-square-foot apartment. Power isn't about what you control. It's about what you're willing to sacrifice for the people who matter. She kissed him then, cutting off whatever else he might have said. When they pulled apart, she was smiling. The clinic needs a new security system, she said. And better surgical lighting. And probably a second examination room. Done. And you're doing the dishes. Max laughed, the sound echoing in the empty penthouse. Negotiated like a true queen. I'm not a queen. Melissa took his hand. I'm just a medic who married a mafia boss and somehow survived to tell the tale. And I'm just a mafia boss who learned that the best things in life happen in the shadows. They left the penthouse together, descending from the tower toward the flats, toward the clinic, toward a life built not on power or wealth, but on the simple, radical choice to stay. 3 days later, a sleek black car pulled up to Melissa's clinic. Max stepped out carrying takeout and a toolbox, ready to install the new security cameras. He never left. And in the margins of the city, in the shadows where people went to survive, Maxwell and Melissa Perkins built something no amount of money could buy. A home. A partnership. A love forged in blood and trust. And every person who walked through that clinic door knew they'd found sanctuary. Because some stories don't end in palaces. They end in the places where broken people learn to heal each other. One stitch at a time. Thank you for watching this story to the end. Please subscribe if you enjoyed this story. You will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as I can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.